everything. Welcome, everyone. Oh, it's so great to see you joining. Let me know where you're logging on from. We'll get the show started right at 12 o'clock sharp. There it is. It's so great to see you. Hello, Patty. I've missed you guys. All right, everyone, welcome to the first episode of the DoughDr for 2023. I'm your host and baking expert, Chef Colette, and I have a great show planned for you. A big shout out to all the bakers who sent me questions over our break, and we're just going to jump in. And you'll be surprised, or maybe not, bakers, my awesome bakers. Can I just say how much I've missed you? All right. Now, you'll be surprised that most of the questions that came in were about bread. So, you know, I was kind of thinking over the break, what are we going to do? What's going to be our baking energy for 2023? I know that sounds a little wooey, but really, what's the vibe? And for today, the vibe is all about bread. So let's jump into the questions. And I'm getting greetings. Ciao, Leo. Oh, I'm so happy to see you. So, all right. So our first baking question was regarding sourdough starter. And this came from one of our bakers, Christy. And Christy wrote in and she's like, Chef, my starter is exploding out of the container and I'm feeding it different ratios of flour and water. What's the best? Like a whole barrage of questions. So I just said, so what I want Christy to know is that, number one, when we're building our sourdough starters, you need to use a tall enough container. Because what's happening, bakers, is there are wild natural yeasts in the environment. And so when we create a mixture of flour and water, think of it like the Matrix. I mean, like maybe not full Keanu, but it's like a matrix of flour and water, and it attracts, whoops, sorry about that. It attracts the wild natural yeast that's everywhere. I mean, literally everywhere. And it sucks in that yeast, and that yeast begins to feed, because the yeast it's like a nutritional source. So the yeast is attracted to it, and then the natural yeast begins to feed off the starches in the flour and water mixture, and it also gets to hydrate a little bit. And then as it gets full, it begins to create, I have a sample right here for you, little tiny bubbles, carbon dioxide gas. Now, when you're building your starters, and some of you watching in the audience may be veterans, you may have had a starter, you know, like this one, like Sophia, for 60 years. I don't know, or maybe you just started one last week. But there may be some of you where the thought of maintaining a sourdough starter blows your mind. But our first question came in about starters, so we're gonna cover it. So that's what's going on, and the main thing is to make sure your container is tall enough, because as it begins to grow, as you discard and feed, what do I mean by discard? Well, part of maintaining a sourdough starter is using part of it, or if you're on a maintenance schedule, you've got to get rid of part of it. And students say, okay, where I remember at the culinary school, like teaching in culinary school, we had to throw the starter in the garbage because we couldn't pour it down the drain. It would clog up the pipes. But if you compost or your community compost, sourdough starter discards can go in the compost. Just not down your sink. That's not good because it glues up your pipes. All right, so Christy, larger container. And then the other thing she asked is once you have a loaf, whether it's a sourdough-based loaf or it's a commercial yeast-based loaf, because it's all yeast, it's all the same. But when we use sourdough starters and we're using all natural yeast, the process is different because commercial yeast works incredibly fast. So the second part of Christy's question is she got from Amazon Banneton molds. And I tell you, bakers, Amazon has some great deals on these beautiful Banneton baskets, and they're priced really well. They come, it's like a little kit with a razor blade to slash your doughs and a dough cutter. It's like, woo, it's so exciting. But then you get it home and you think, well, what do I do with it? Do I spray it? Do I put a liner in it? Oh, there we go. Next thing, one thing I forgot. Oh yeah, I couldn't forget to tell, sorry for the pause, but some of these baskets come with linen liners, and those of you who know all about bread know that this is called a couche. And yeah, I pulled mine out of the freezer because that's where I keep them. They're impossible to wash. So what we do with these, if you happen to have a linen lined basket, best thing to do is just put the sucker in a plastic bag and put it in the freezer, knock out the excess flour, and don't even sweat it. So these are how these baskets come. And then, oh goodness. We use them to proof existing dough. All right, you with me, bakers? So Christy's question was, how do I use this Banneton mold? And then she said, okay, how do I use it and how do I get the dough out of the mold? And I was like, wow, that's great. You guys would love to see that. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to, this is ready for baking, and we're going to unmold this loaf of sourdough bread and load it into the oven. Okay, so this Banneton mold, which I took out of Le Cordon Bleu. So if anybody's watching from Le Cordon Bleu, when things were ending, I took 2 of these Banneton molds because they were for the asking. And these have no linen liner. So how do we handle that? Well, what we have to do is we have to coat the basket with flour. And I usually use all-purpose flour, even though my dough is made with bread flour, because that extra bit of starch helps the flour stick to the mold. If we don't flour the mold, or we don't use the liner, which we flour generously, it's a train wreck. The dough sticks and it's a mess. The only thing we can do is freeze the mold until the dough freezes and we can chip it away. And that's a tip for you really serious bread bakers. My hardcore bread bakers. If you get dough on your linen fabric, if you have some sort of a mishap with your molds, freeze them. And the excess chips away. All right? So now, again, back to Christy. she was asking, like, what do I do? It looks like it's stuck. It's scary. Well, you have choices. And I have a baking stone in the oven. And for this week's post to follow up onto class, I'm going to talk about starting a simple starter and the equipment that you need and the equipment that's nice to have. So if you have any kind of a baking tray, and I have a lightly greased piece of parchment paper, and this is just cake goo, which I talk about all the time. You could also lightly, very lightly spray if you're trying to use up that last can of pan spray. And what we're going to do is we're just going to invert the loaf over over our parchment paper. And usually it sticks and it gets really scary. So I flip it back. I want you guys to see that you can survive this, because you can. And then I just pull, I loosen it from the edge. I kind of just very gently, I'm not deflating anything. And you could do this before, but you had to see the flip back. Oh, by the way, I'm using a new iPad. So if I'm looking in the wrong place, just yell at me in the comments, okay? I'm trying to look into the camera, but honestly, bakers, I'm not sure where it is. Oh, that's a lie. I know where it is. Okay, so now we're going to do this again. I loosen the edges and just be very gentle and intentional. And it comes eventually, like Christmas. You're like, I know, we just had Christmas. And there it is. So this is at a 68% hydration, and that's a tease because we're going to talk about hydration next. And all I need to do is slash it. And then I'm going to load it into the oven, which is at 440 degrees. And this loaf of bread will take at least 35 to 40 minutes to bake. And I will bake it until it registers at least 205 degrees on an instant read thermometer. So I wanted to show you, you can find really fancy lambs, and that's the little holder for the razor blade to slash your doughs, or you can use a serrated knife. I'm going to use this part of the knife, and I'm just going to slash down the center, 1/4 inch thick. And I know everybody says, oh, only slash once, but sometimes you got to slash twice. I'm just going to go right down the center. That's it. I'm going to take my spray bottle and I'm going to spray until it looks like I sprayed, and then it's going into the oven. All right? And then we're going to answer more questions. All right. So that's it. That is the extent of Christy's questions, which was how to deal with an overflowing starter, how to get dough out of a Banneton mold, and then how to set up for baking. Now, if you really get into it, you can get a peel like you would use for pizza. This one I found for under $20, and on the post I will put all the links in. And I do love this thing because look at this. It folds up and you can store it easily. All right. So bakers, any questions about what we did just now? Put it in the comments. And I just have to give a shout out. There is a brand new book on sourdough by Maurizio Leo. and it's called The Perfect Loaf, and it piggybacks off of his incredible website, and which is also called The Perfect Loaf. I cannot recommend it enough. I will get you started, but he can take you the distance, my sourdough bakers. This is a great resource. And again, I'll put a link to his book on the website. All right, so now, oh my goodness, here we go. So my notes have notes. So Dory wrote in, our baker Dory, and she asked about how to make a plant-based donut, or more specifically, how to take your favorite regular donut recipe and make it plant-based. Okay, so this is what you do. The substitutions are pretty easy. Normally, donuts are an enriched dough, so they have milk, they have eggs, and they have fat. So for the milk, replace the milk with a plant-based milk like almond, oat, rice, or soy. It doesn't really matter. I would say for me, almond milk is my favorite plant-based milk to bake with. It seems the unsweetened almond milk seems the most neutral, but then at the same time, oat milk is super creamy and kind of gorgeous. So that's another option. Whatever is your favorite. And any questions about that, just drop them in the comments. So regular milk, plant-based milk, 1-to-1 substitution. Butter or fat, butter. Use a plant-based butter, and there's really some good brands out there. I don't know if Country Crock is watching, but for a while I could only get Country Crock plant-based sticks, and they worked pretty well. You know, when we were having those shortages, Earth Balance sort of disappeared from my neighborhood grocery, so I was using Country Crock, and it was fine. You can also make your own. There's plenty of plant-based butter recipes on the internet. Now for the eggs. Bakers, this is where you're going to be maybe surprised, maybe not. But I'm going to recommend to Dory that she uses, instead of eggs, the same amount of aquafaba. Not whipped, just the liquid. And what you're going to do is a regular large egg. We usually count it as weighing 50 grams. And if we really want to be granular about it, a large egg weighs between 48 and 50 grams. So it's really easy to round up to 50. So if your recipe calls for 2 large eggs, you would instead just use 100 grams of the aquafaba bean liquid. All right, so that's how you would handle that. No whipping it, just literally right from the can, and then make a batch of hummus, because if you're baking plant-based, you know that the flip side of baking plant-based and using aquafaba is that you're swimming in garbanzo beans, and there's nothing wrong with that. And then, so butter, egg replacer, and milk, everything, it should work pretty much just fine. Don't freak out about using aquafaba. You won't taste the bean in the finished donut, but if it worries you, you could always use an egg replacer like Bob's Red Mill. There's several on the market now, and you just follow the directions on the package to make the equivalent of the amount of egg that you need. So that's it as far as plant-based donuts. Now, I'm holding off on a larger question, so I'm going to go to a shorter question that came in from our baker, Jeannie. Now, Jeannie asked about my macaron book, because yesterday I posted a story about my macaron book being available on Amazon. And before I go any further, bakers, I must apologize to you because I said something that was in error. We are not quite Prime eligible yet, but we're getting there. Amazon has certain criteria, and we're working on meeting them, so that will happen. And then also I want to get the book available on Kindle, because recently I have absolutely fallen in love with books on Kindle. In fact, I'm getting rid of most of my cookbooks, taking them to the thrift store, really being a minimalist as far as that goes, and just enjoying all the great content on Kindle. So I will get that book on Kindle. So that's the update on the book. So Jeannie's question that came when I posted that story, she was like, Chef, there are different ratios for sugar and other ingredients in the different macarons. And the answer to that is that depending on the technique, because in the book, I illustrate 5 different techniques for making macarons. Depending on the technique, the ratios of the ingredients are going to be different. Now I know for those of you who love to make macarons, there's the 2 favorite methods are either French meringue or Italian meringue. And we get I've been stuck on the French meringue version for years, probably teach it 89% of the time. So we get stuck on that particular ratio. But as we begin to swap out techniques, the amounts are going to be different. So Jeannie, I hope that answers your questions. All right. So now, then another question came in right this morning. When I posted that we were going to be live at noon, and this comes from our baker, Pistol Packing Mama. And this is a great question, and it's going to piggyback onto the bigger question that I'm going to close the show with. Pistol Packing Mama asked about when baking or making English muffins, what is the internal temperature that we're looking for? When do we know that they're done? All right, I'm going to turning around, and I'm grabbing a thermometer. This is what I'm talking about, bakers. This is an instant read thermometer, which I know that you already know, but I want to be very, very clear. And, you know, some bread bakers don't like to take internal temperatures, but I do. So I like to be sure. There's a couple of ways we can tell when our bread is done, and English muffins always have yeast in them, whether they're made with commercial yeast or they're sourdough English muffins, because yeast is yeast, and so it's good to know when they're done. The other thing about English muffins is they're tricky because they are they start at a high hydration. So what does that mean? And that's going to piggyback onto our final topic for the day. So when we create a dough, like the dough I just put in the oven, when we create a dough, the level of water compared to the amount of flour is the hydration level. And so English muffins are high hydration. So what we need to do when we have a high hydration dough, we've got to bake out that excess moisture. Now, when you take a professional course, your instructors, talk about baking out excess moisture until we are blue, and I mean blue in the face. Those of you who've been through a pastry program, put it in the comments that I am right, because I know I'm not always right, but this time I'm right. So, but when we bake at home, we don't usually get this. But I'm telling you, we've got to bake out that excess moisture. So my answer for Pistol Packing Mama is 205. And also the other indicator, because the color, the golden brown, beautiful bake on them is not an indicator of doneness. So what you want to do, take them out of the oven, and with a dry towel or your oven mitts, pick one up in the center of the tray, not an outlier on the edge, but one toward the middle of the tray that hasn't seen maybe all the heat, because everything on the outside bakes more quickly, and you pick it up. And if it feels heavy, then give it a few more minutes. And know For those of you who like to bake English muffins, or you're intrigued with English muffins and their cousin crumpets, many English muffin recipes don't have you bake the English muffins at all. You fry them until they're done. Just know that that's 10 to 12 minutes on each side. And you're going to be flipping them over back and forth so they don't brown. Now, years ago, when I was in culinary school at New England Culinary Institute and working in the bakery, we made English muffins to sell in the bakery. And Chef Jack, God knows where he is now, I hope he's well, he taught us we'd griddle them really beautifully, and then we'd put them in the oven for about 8 minutes to make sure they weren't wet on the inside, because it's a high hydrated dough and you want the assurance that it's fully baked. So when you do a traditional English muffin, and especially if you like them thick, you know, like a Wolferman's type English muffin, throw them in the oven at 350 for a couple minutes. Well, what did I say? Like 8 to 10 to finish that bake. It'll make a world of difference. 350 won't get any more color on them. They'll stay the same color as they were griddled, but they'll be done inside. Okay? So you can try that. And I see your comment about just not putting them in the oven. Then you still need to get to about at least 205 would be best. Anything lower, I'd be a little concerned. You can also sacrifice one and open it up, you know, and just to make sure. But know that when you're griddling, it's going to take a while. You know, especially baking commercially, they had to be finished in the oven, because if a customer had opened up an underdone English muffin, they would be at that bakery counter raising all sorts of heck, you know. So, all right. So that is that question. Now, our final topic of the day piggybacks, and that is on hydration levels in dough. Our baker, I'm going to call her JGF111. She asked me on Wednesday's post, or she said she'd like to learn about hydration levels in dough. And I already explained that. Hydration levels mean the amount of liquid, usually water, compared to the amount of flour. And that creates a dough that's very manageable and easy to use. And then it can, if the water amount is higher, it creates something that we can't handle with our bare hands. And we need special tools like this or oil to handle it. All right? Now, bakers, while I do this very last thing, I would like your opinion, and I would like to know what you would like to see, because JGF's 111's comment, it worked in my brain for days. For the first part of 2023, would you like to learn kind of like a bread school or a little bread intensive where we started with low hydrated doughs for demo and we went on to higher hydrated doughs? So something starting with something like a bagel, and in the end we'll finish with something like ciabatta, which can be at a 90% hydration. Crazy town. But the more liquid, the larger the holes in the finished product. All right? So put that in the chat if that sounds good to you, because that feels like the right thing to do. Pistol Packing Mama, you're in. She says that would be wonderful. And you know, bread books don't do that. I don't think anybody's done that. So that'll be a first, Baker. We're just gonna blow it out. Awesome. A few glimpses. Yay. Lobster Lover likes it too. Awesome. We're in. So the post that I'm going to put on bakingwithcolette.com for this week, for Monday, is going to teach you how to make a simple sourdough starter and how to maintain it. There'll be links to the new Fresh Loaf book, which is excellent, to equipment, and just a recap of the show. But next week, we will start with our lower hydrated bread, and then we're going to move forward. And my hope is that we'll use the first part of 2023 to get your bread and yeast confidence, both commercial and natural, like over the charts. All right? Great. Dr. John says, awesome. Patty's in. BB Cab as well. All right, before we go, I don't think I've done this on the show, but this is my very active, lovely starter. Oh, and by the way, she's ready to be fed. So I'd like to show you before we go how I feed my starter. And then we'll wrap for today and we'll start back in next week on our bread journey, low hydration to high hydration. All right, so what I do very simply, and this is so easy to remember, and I am indebted to my bread sister, Chef Gina, for her genius, because all you have to do, and I'm maintaining, I'm not going to bake with her, but look at her. On a maintenance cycle, she's rocking. She's so healthy. And I break rules, bakers. I don't always feed her. I always feed her good flour, and that's all you need. You need good flour. You don't have to spend up like crazy. It has to be unbleached. So I put in 50 grams of water, and the water I just use filtered water. If you use tap water, let it sit out for a couple hours to dissipate the chlorine. I'm going to add 100 grams of starter. And since I'm not baking, this is going to go in the compost because my apartment building composts. And then 50 grams of flour. And I'm just going to take my spatula. I'm going to get rid of the scale. And I hope you guys like this new setup because you can see Chef Daniel, he mentioned that that sometimes you couldn't see the work surface. So I was like, okay, I'm on it. Fix it. So I hope this is better. So what I do is I mix pretty well. And then one last comment before we go, bakers. Don't be afraid to mix your starters. If you have an existing starter, they like to be oxygenated. So, I mean, not like crazy town, but don't worry that you're going to over mix it. I mixed this for about a minute. And one last thing, clean the side of that bowl. Make sure everything is combined. And that's a good rule of thumb for all your baking. Take a moment, take a breath, scrape down the bowl. All right, bakers, I'm going to let you go. But thank you so much for joining me today. It's so great to be back with you. Next week, our first low hydrated dough. Have those questions. Keep those questions coming. Questions do not need to be about bread. They can be about any aspect of baking. If you want to ask me a life question, I don't know, I'll try to tackle it. But it doesn't have to be just bread. That's just how it happened today, except we did have a donut question. Thank you, Dory. And we had a macaron question. Thank you, Jeannie. Thank you to all of you who dropped in questions. I so, so appreciate it. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Get in the kitchen and do some baking. See you next week. Bye.